All right, after the last video, I realized we only had 2 slides left, so I just thought I'd bring us home and not just give Mr. Davis the crumbs. That wouldn't be very fair. So we were talking about evolutionary psychology, about how what survives might explain how this behavior came to be. That is evolutionary psychology. So one of the things that we talk about is natural selection. Now, natural selection and evolution are two things that work together. And in fact, I probably should have evolution first and natural selection second. So that's just what I'm going to do. I'm going to talk about evolution first. I have bolded and italicized the word change. Evolution simply means change. And when people talk about whether they agree or disagree with evolution, there are certain things that I think maybe they're talking about natural selection and not evolution because um, humans change. They just do. For instance, are we taller now than we were 150 years ago as humans? Yes, we are. We just are. So we have changed. We have evolved. Why? Well, then we get into natural selection. So when we talk about evolution, we just want to talk about have the inherited characteristics of biological populations change over generations. Yeah, I mean, we just are. You can't deny that we're taller. Whatever you want to call it, we've changed. Go ahead and change the name. I don't care. But humans have changed over time. They do. Now, the question is, why do they change over time? And that is where natural selection comes in. Basically, if I evolved, if I changed, if something happened where I developed X-ray vision, that would be really cool. And you know what? That trait might survive. Natural selection might select for that and say people who have X-ray vision really have an advantage over generations. If I developed, like I talked about in the previous slide, if I developed an allergy to the sun, where I died if I were in the sun, that might not survive. So all that's saying is that biological traits become either more or less common in a population. If the adaptation is advantageous to a species, it will survive. If it is not advantageous, it probably won't survive. So, and then we can get into something where Stephen Jay Gould said that there are certain things called spandrels that survived even when we didn't know why they survived. But all of this is sort of Monday morning quarterbacking where we're looking back and saying, why does this exist? That's one of the problems with evolutionary psychology is we're trying to explain backwards and we really can't run experiments on it. So it's not truly science. So what'll happen is genes mutate all the time. They do. That's what cancer is. So genes mutate all the time. And when there is an error in gene replication, it could be a good thing, it could be a bad thing. We don't know. Nature then selects, natural selection selects for that change in the genes. And we know that there are multiple errors in gene replication. Now, what we find is there are certain environmental factors that affect how genes replicate. They also affect how genes display themselves. For instance, one of the great examples is schizophrenia. What they find is that schizophrenia is genetic. It's very highly heritable, and we're going to talk about this in the next one. But it doesn't mean if your parents had schizophrenia that you're going to get it. There are certain environmental factors that might cause you to get it. For instance, one of the great environmental factors is drugs. Hallucinogenic drugs have been known to trigger schizophrenic reactions and trigger schizophrenia in people. Now, did the drugs cause it? Yes and no. Did the genes cause it? Well, yes and no. You have a gene sitting in there ready to be switched on by the environment. That is epigenetics. So all epigenetics is, does the environment switch on a gene that might have been off? And if you want to study epigenetics, fascinating stuff. It really is. And if you are in biology or studied that very much, you know probably a lot more than I do. And then the last thing I want to talk about is heritability. And I'm going to pause the video and I'm going to go find a graphic that I think super explains it. So when we talk about heritability, this graphic really helps because you've heard like 60% of your intelligence is genetic. Well, what does that even mean? Which 60%? You can't say that. That's what we're trying to say is heritability. What we're saying is it's 60% heritable. Well, what does that mean? This is a great graphic that is actually in your book, I think. But if it's not, then it should be. So I'm going to point it out. So the difference between these plants, they have the same soil, they have the same light. The difference between these plants has to do with genes. So two plants in the same soil with the same light, with the same water will grow to different heights. Why? Because of genetics. Now, we have deficient soil over here. So we have crappy soil. They're shorter. Why are they shorter? Is it because of genes? No, it's because of their environment. What is the difference between these plants, though? That's genetics. So when we're talking about heritability, what we're saying is if all things are equal, there will be differences between people. And the differences between people in the same environment will be heritability. How can we explain the differences between people in the same environment? Say for you, if you were born happy and healthy and you got enough food and you got all the things you want, there are going to be differences in your intelligence. How do we explain the differences? Through heritability, because you had the same environment. Now, here's the thing. You cannot compare these two. Heritability does not explain the difference. So the difference between your intelligence and somebody who was born in an environment where they didn't have enough food. They lived in a war zone. They were orphans. All of these other things, they had bad soil. So we cannot talk about genetic inheritance between the two groups. We can only talk about it within a group. So let's go back to this and let's bring this home. So heritability is the extent to which differences among a population, one of those two, not between the populations, but among a population, is accounted for by genes. That's what we're talking about. And that's what we're talking about when we're talking about evolution, genetics, all that other stuff. So that's how we're bringing it home. And this is the end of chapter 3. We're done. Wow.